The meeting today is open to members of the public, and thank you to those members of the public who have attended. We have people attending in person and we have people attending online as well. We are attempting the hybrid meeting here, which will hopefully work okay, and we're very much welcoming contributions from members of the public today, particularly around the item on public questions, which we've undertaken in co-production with members of the public. So thank you to those of you who've come along for that. The agenda and reports for today's meeting are available on the Council's website and via the Modern Gov app. A small amount of paper copies are also available, and the meeting will be webcast and the recording will be available later as well. Can I request that all mobile phones are switched to silent, please, so as not to disturb the conduct of the meeting? And just to explain, there is no fire test planned for today. So if there is an emergency evacuation, please follow instructions from the Town Hall staff and assemble on Tudor Square. So we'll start by asking members to introduce themselves. I'm Councillor Fran Belbin, Chair of the committee.
I'm Councillor Mary Lee, Councillor for Darnell Ward.
Councillor Laura Moynihan, Manor Castle Ward.
Councillor Ruth Milson, Crooks and Crosspool Ward, and substituting for Councillor Norris this morning.
Paul Turpin, Green Councillor for Gleethas Valley Ward.
Councillor Mike Leavery, West Ecclesfield Ward.
Councillor Sue Alston for Fulwood Ward and Deputy Chair of this committee.
Councillor Simon Clement Jones, Peachtree and Greenhill Ward.
Thank you. And if I ask the officers along the front to introduce themselves from that side.
Morning, I'm Jason Deeds, Democratic Services.
Morning everyone, I'm Laurie Brennan, Head of Policy and Partnerships.
Sarah Hyde, Democratic Services.
Without feedback this time, David Hollis, General Counsel.
Thank you, and I suggest I won't ask the members of the public to introduce themselves, but if you do contribute, if you could say your name when you start so that we capture it for the minutes. Thank you. Just to say, first of all, we are proposing a slight change to the agenda and that we move the item on councillor role profiles to item 8 on the above item 8 on the agenda. That's partly because we have a public question relating to that, and I'm proposing that we take the public questions on that item with that item as part of the discussion. Can I get the apologies, please, Sarah?
Yes, Chair, I've got apologies from Councillor Alison Norris.
Thank you. We'll also note that there are no items to exclude the press and public. And can I check whether members have any declarations of interest? Okay. Next item is the minutes of the previous meeting. Can we agree that they're a correct record? Seeing nods, thank you. Item 6 being the public questions, I think I've already referred to. We will come to those at the relevant point on the agenda. So we'll move us straight then to the item on public questions and petitions, where I think Laurie and Alice will be presenting on this.
Thank you, Chair. I'm delighted to be able to present this paper today. I think it's a good opportunity for this committee to have demonstrated a different way of working through the committee system and engaging members of the public, working alongside citizens, working with members and officers to look at how we resolve the challenge, or a challenge in a way that could improve the way we do business and the governance is undertaken in Sheffield. It builds on things we did in the 6-month review, so it takes on one of the actions, specific recommendations from that piece of work. And it also gave us the opportunity to try and use this committee to operate in a quite a different way. As you'll see on the agenda, there are 2 items for this. There's a cover paper that just sets out where we've got to and some next steps, including a time frame for what happens after today. And then there's a more detailed paper which sets out the recommendations the specific recommendations in about 5 packages of proposals. What I propose to do is I'll just quickly introduce the cover paper, and then if we go into the conversation around the longer appendix, which goes into the specific proposal for how we'd like to move forward on public questions. after each set of proposals, I'll try and introduce them without reading them out, because you've all got the copies of the paper in front of you. And then I think, Chair, if it's okay, I think we'll try and pause after each set of proposals so we can have a conversation, members can input into that, and citizens are in the room and not on screen as well. I think it just enables us to have a more discursive conversation here rather than just trying to present a paper back, which I wasn't intending to do. So, just very, very briefly, the cover paper sets out the work we've done to date in a very short number of paragraphs, particularly in section 2, setting out what we've done with citizens through workshops and with members to look at how we improve the model of public questions, which I think we appreciated didn't work particularly for anybody really. I think there were frustrations on all sides with how it was operating. So what I think we've pulled together here is a pretty coherent package of ways in which citizens can engage in Sheffield's democratic meetings, and be that through things like written questions, responses, verbal supplementary questions and statements. But also, as you'll see in the other sets of proposals in the appendix, some sort of wiring changes behind the scene to change the customer experience in that. So how we better manage the system of public questions, how people can submit them, but also how we have almost like a journey tracker so that people can see at which point public questions have got to, particularly if there's an action or a response needed to that. As it says in section 3, I think this is an important opportunity now, because this is the first time we've played back really everything citizens have talked about and members have talked about. And it's a draft. It still needs some work. It still needs some nuancing, because they're pretty short statements about what the recommendation is. And so therefore there's an opportunity here for us all to have a discussion about that and develop those proposals further, with the intention of bringing it back to this committee on the 27th of March for consideration, and then we'll put that forward pending the committee's support for that as a proposal to go to the AGM, a full council in May. As I've said, if you look at paragraph 3.2, it just sort of sets out that these are sort of work in progress, and we need to consider collectively how we make all these work in practice. Some of that's on the officer side and also with members as well. And for example, we need to think about things like the interplay between the different recommendations. So how written questions and responses and supplementaries work and statements, and how does that play out at a committee meeting in practice. We also need to think about how we make sure Jason and my teams and member capacity as well is there behind the scenes to support a different model of working. We've got a set approach to doing this at the minute, and we need to think about where the resource and capacity sits to make that work. So in advance of this meeting, the chair of the governance committee has written to citizens, inviting people to participate in this conversation today. But there's also an online survey where we've been deliberately very specific. So it's not a long survey, but you can give a view on every element of the recommendations, and we'd really encourage citizens to participate in that, and actually officers and members as well, if that's something you'd like to do. The survey will be out until the 6th of March, after which we'll take this away and work it up, and there's a timetable on 3.5 that just sets out that sort of route map into the AGM on the 15th of May. So, without any further ado, I'm not going to go back through the detail in the appendix paper. I think I'd like to move on to section 5, which is the recommendations, which comes out of all the work we've done and thinking about the issues we've been trying to address. And as you'll see in the table, what Alice has tried to set out, and thanks massively to Alice for all the work she's put into this, we've set out a summary of what we've heard from the online surveys, from the conversations and the workshops, and from members and officers about some of the challenges in public questions, and then the recommendations we're proposing to introduce to try and remedy or address those specific issues. So, in proposal 1, this is particularly about looking at how we improve the quality and overall experience of public questions. So this was trying to address the experience of people who'd submitted public questions, and how people felt about that experience, how we engaged them as a council, how the response was received, and also thinking about the accountability for that response as well, so how that was presented or answered in a public setting, and also the timeliness. So under the recommendations, what we've set out here is the proposal to have a 12-month trial for the forthcoming municipal year, of a different model for public questions in Sheffield. This will apply to full council and the policy committees, but the local area committee approach will remain unchanged as it stands. I'll work through the recommendations from 1.1 onwards. So the first one, I'll summarise it, I won't read it all out, but the first one is any question can be submitted for 6 working days before a meeting, and the question and response will be published as a written answer before that relevant meeting. Urgent questions, i.e. things that can't be reasonably been anticipated in advance of the written question deadline, can be submitted 3 days in advance. So that could be something like a contemporary event that something happens and therefore it's perfectly legitimate for an urgent public question. But also anything that relates to a specific agenda item as well, so i.e. that a citizen wouldn't have known in advance of the agenda being published. The 1.3 sets out that the question can only, in full council, the question can only be asked on an issue which the council has responsibility or which directly affects the city. And for policy committees, it should be about a matter which the policy committee itself has responsibility, i.e. within its remit. 1.4 sets out, after viewing a written response, questioners may still choose to attend a meeting and will be able to ask a supplementary question. We're also suggesting that we should probably introduce a word limit on public questions as well to ensure that it enables people to be very specific about the question that's being asked and able to more time and space for other people to ask questions as well and to be able to target a more coherent response. 1.6 sets out that introduce the ability for citizens to make statements, and this takes learning specifically from Bristol City Council particularly, but as you'll see, it just sets out some parameters around that, a 1-minute timeline and a time frame to be able to speak and for those to be submitted 2 days in advance. I won't read out all the detail because you've got it in front of you. 1.7 is for the members to receive draft responses ahead of 1 day ahead of the meeting. This is particularly to enable greater accountability and so that members can see that, understand what's being said, and then also members take ownership of that in the meeting. And of course, the members could challenge back if they're not comfortable with the response, and that's an important part of the political accountability process. Subject to the Chair's discretion, the time for public questions and petitions will remain at 30 minutes. Important to retain that discretion in there. We're going to set out new advice and guidance and a consistent response format for officers so we improve the consistency and quality of response from across the committee system. The approach of public questions at local area committees will remain unchanged, as I said. And then just finally, at the end of that 12 months, we'll undertake a review which will engage citizens in to give feedback about how that's bedding in and how that feels. There's an end section that says why we're doing this, but I think I've probably covered that already. So if that's okay, Chair, I'll pause there for members and citizens in the room to contribute and give some feedback on those proposals. Thanks.
Thank you, Laurie. And I think we'll find with this set of recommendations, certainly in the survey so far, this has probably attracted the most comment and they're probably the most far-reaching changes that are being proposed to. So we'll have a bit of extra time, particularly for this set of recommendations, I think. So can I see if anybody would like to comment? Simon.
Yeah, it's really on the in terms of 1.3 in the recommendations, in terms of which questions will be allowed. Obviously, Sheffield City Council doesn't have a foreign policy, and we do find certain questions do address international issues. But obviously, the citizens of the city, obviously concerned about that and want to find out the council. I'm wondering who's going to be making those decisions and kind of how sort of tight they are. Obviously, if it's something that Westminster has the issue for, will it just be ruled out? And I'm wondering how it's going to be different to what we currently have, and what almost right of appeal people have to say. Well, I think this does affect the city. I can see the sense behind it. Obviously, it doesn't seem quite often that the questions or petitions are relevant in terms of what the council can do. Has a responsibility to represent the people of the city to other organisations. So I'm just wondering how broad or how narrow that's going to be, and and I say, who makes that decision, and you know, where obviously if somebody's asked a question, if it's ruled out, if that decision will then itself be made public and the reasons for it.
Thanks. We'll ask David to respond to that.
So the constitution in the council procedure rules does at the moment have some guidelines around what questions are permitted. I think that would benefit from some clarity and making clear that applies to all committees, because at the moment the way it's drafted it reads as though it only applies to full council, although it should probably apply to all policy committees, and that is the way that we apply that. The decisions on whether questions fall within those parameters are made by myself as monitoring officer, and I consult with James Henderson, who's the head of policy and democratic engagement. We do notify people where we think that those are not permissible, and give an opportunity to reword where we think that they may be permissible if they're reworded. So there is an iterative process in there. It can be quite time consuming, but we do go through that to try and ensure that as many questions as possible are actually permitted.
Thanks. Paul?
Thank you very much. So a few questions, if I try and fire them all off and see, look for Laurie to come back. So 1.1, 6 working days before a meeting, I think that would be useful to say like the time of the day, and I always find it unhelpful when it's by 9 AM on that day, so perhaps it would just match up with the time the meeting begins. A word limit on public questions, I think a time limit is better, you know, people speak at different paces, some words are longer than other words, some words are hyphenated, etc. The 30 minutes at the chair's discretion. Now, I can only think maybe of once or twice where the chair has not allowed the time to roll over, because usually, you know, we're all very interested in what the public has to say. And when that has happened, it's kind of been a bit like, you're annoying me, I don't agree with you, I'm not going to allow public questions to continue. So I would prefer to err on the side of going for an hour and basically removing the chair's discretion on that, given that almost every time it is likely to overrun 30 minutes, the chair allows it to in any case. I think it would be better to come back rather than forward on that, if that makes sense. And finally, on the 1.10, the public questions at local area committees, and I've said before in our workshops that I think it works well, and Simon's the venerable chair of the South Lac where I am, and always allows good public discussion and dialogue between members and members of the public. I would just add to that about the triaging element of this new system, that when somebody does ask a question, that you know, there might be times we say, well, we don't know the answer, or we'll give you a written response, or we might try and answer it, but we'll still give you a better written response, that is fed back into our new triage system so that it's dealt with in the best way, and then put onto that oh gosh, I've lost the sorry, you know, where it's kind of been followed through its actions. Is that okay? Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Does anyone want to come back on those, or shall we take a few questions and think? Yeah, Bruce.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like just to follow on what Councillor Turpin's just said about the lack public questions. I think there are other ways, obviously, for the public to engage through the LACs, and it's a really potentially very good forum for a lot more discursive interaction. So I think it's important to get the public questions right at those meetings, but also keep the balance so that it's not just a few people having that discussion, but that all attendees are able to discuss. So I think there's a good balance with a workshop style to public LAC meetings, and expanding the public questions doesn't necessarily increase participation, I think, but I would comment that perhaps there could be more dialogue with members of the public who want to ask questions before the public meetings, so that you don't have situations where members of the public give up their time to turn up to a committee meeting only to be told, all we've got for you is a written answer in the future, because that's incredibly frustrating. So I think there could be more dialogue before you get to the meeting date, maybe built into the system, so that maybe more ideally a member of the public might then attend a meeting already knowing the answer. I think that's suggested in the report, and able to have more discussion, a more discursive experience in the meeting. And I'd like to just make a comment as well about that obviously public questions aren't the be-all and end-all of involvement, and although it's vitally important to get it right, but there's plenty of scope with committees to craft an appropriate culture of involvement, and create those structures individually as committees. And I think that the committee that I sit on, Adult Health and Social Care normally, has created a lot of involvement culture for people who use the services that are provided. And I think that is worth looking at that as a model. It's taken a lot of hard work, but that culture is now fully embedded in that policy area. So I think that's quite a good model to examine. And also just to comment that if you think how people normally communicate with each other, it's quick fire discussion, WhatsApp, Snapchat, and the council, when you look at it in comparison with that, the way that people talk to each other, is incredibly old-fashioned, isn't it? So I'm not suggesting WhatsApp is a way to conduct council business, but I think we do need to really look at modernising and getting into that more discursive realm with the public.
Thank you, Ruth. I've got Diane and Sue. I do encourage members of the public to contribute as well. Feel free to put your hands up too. I am looking on screen as well.
Thank you, Fran. First of all, can I give my apologies for my late arrival? I had a prior meeting overrun, and unfortunately, no matter how much you try and put in a day, time isn't elastic. I welcome this as an exercise in attempting to sort out the complications of the public question system, because it is complex, and our meetings are formal meetings, and very often that in itself poses barriers to people that just simply want to come and ask a simple question. And for when people come to full council, it is a big deal for them. So in that sense, yes, a 6-day deadline for asking questions does give officers time to prepare a response to be presented to those individuals, and may seem, well, I've raised this issue, I've had my answer, and now something's going to get done, or is something going to get done? I think we have to give clarity to that, and we're never going to get, you said we did, because we have so many constraints on what we can do, and as Ruth has alluded to, the processual and legal requirements of what we can do. So I think what I'm trying to say is something in the preamble to say we will attempt to give you a full response, but if not, we'll explain to you how we are going to deal with your question, I think would be helpful and cut out a lot of the frustrations that people feel when they come to speak to the council. I hope that made sense and wasn't too rambling. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. I think some of that is covered in some of the later proposals as well, so we can come back to that discussion as well. Sue?
Thank you. I've just got a few comments and then maybe a question as well. So just sort of going through these recommendations in order, I mean, I think the 6 working days for most questions would work, and I would hope that one of the advantages of doing this is that we drastically reduce the number of times we have to say, we'll come back to you with the answer, which I think is the most unsatisfactory thing. I know it's always going to happen sometimes, but I would hope that that would really reduce the number of times that happens. I agree with Councillor Turpin about we do need to be clear about a time of day and 9 a.m. isn't ideal. So 12 midday, 5 o'clock, whatever it turns out to be, we do need to be clear about that. I actually feel that it's really important that we have a word limit rather than a time limit for questions. Sorry to disagree, but I disagree. The reason being that we can then advise questioners before the meeting that this is too long, this is, you know, or you've got a bit more time if you want, rather than the awful situation that chairs and, you know, the Lord Mayor end up in, of having to say, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up, you know, because if it's a word limit and it's pre-written, if they take a minute, they take a minute, they take 30 seconds, great. If they take a minute and a half, that's fine, because we've pre-agreed and it allows people just to speak at a pace that they're comfortable with. So I think that would actually be much more helpful. And I think it's something we should try. If it doesn't work, then it doesn't work, but I do think it's something we should try. The other thing I just want to be clear about before I ask my question is on the last point about the evaluation at the end. And I think we need to bear in mind that if we find some of this is going drastically wrong after 2 meetings, we're not going to hold out for 12 months. We can make some change more quickly. My sort of confusion maybe is around the statements, 1.6. So when we first discussed this, my understanding, that my memory from where this came from, was saying that sometimes people don't actually want an answer. What they want is to be able to say, I disagree with you, I think you should do X, or I want you to consider doing Y, but they don't necessarily, you know, they want to support something or disagree with something, and not everybody wants an answer. And that's why we said people should have the option to make statements. It may be something that doesn't get taken up very often, but it would be an option. And yet we've got in here that they will get a written reply within 10 working days. So to my mind, that turns it into a question again. And I'm just a bit confused when it came out of the idea that somebody may want to make a statement without, you know, feeling that they need an answer. And yet we're saying they're going to get an answer. So I'm just a bit confused about how that now is any different from a question.
Thank you, Sue. And yeah, just to emphasise one of the points you made there, the proposal around this is that we, in terms of constitutional change, we would make a broad constitutional change along the lines of public questions will be according to a scheme, so that we weren't constantly having to tweak the constitution, but it would allow us to develop that scheme in response to any unintended consequences, etc. So I think we can avoid getting into the situation where we're constantly tweaking throughout the course of the year, but we've still got a little bit of flexibility. I haven't seen any more hands up. Was that your hand up, Ruth, on screen? Sorry, we have 2 Ruths. Yes, go ahead.
Good morning, can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Sorry to be so big in the room on that ridiculous big screen. Rather than getting into some of the technical detail, can I just make a couple of general comments, please? First of all, I think it's really positive that you've done this review. I think that Sheffield is the only council in the country to have ever done a review of public questions. And that comes from the national lead at the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny. There's been very little work. They've just existed in councils as these kind of dinosaurs. They've just existed for forevermore, really, this thing about public questions. So I think, you know, the councils generally make little incremental change rather than trying to review them. So I think that's something that is really, really positive. The step change I see in this, I might as well remind people that SOS, Sheffield Oversight and Scrutiny, did a citizen scrutiny report and held a public event on public questions. And I hope members, and I know officers, have had an opportunity to see the report and recommendations we did on that. The big step change I see in this report, that isn't actually highlighted, is that there is an effort here to say we would like it to improve accessibility to public questions. The requirement not to attend is a massive step change in terms of accessibility for all citizens to ask a question and for that to be visible, i.e. public. That's a really big thing, and there aren't there aren't many councils, as far as I know, who could make that kind of claim and that kind of commitment. And that's the big positive I see in this report. The only question then becomes how far that commitment then is limited. And I can see all kinds of ways in which that will then be constrained by this technical rule and that technical rule, which will serve it, and the temptation to go down that route. So I would like to see much better upfront and highlighted. We are committed to making public questions accessible to all our citizens so that they can ask a question in public and that be seen by the city. And to always remind ourselves that is the commitment, because I can see all kinds of ways. On the 6-day thing, for example, I mean, a number of our disabled attendees at our public events, that may be a very clear constraint. You may have as little as 12 or 24 hours to read the committee papers. And already on the previous limit, that was a struggle for some disabled people needing to use different technology or finding time and so on. So I think there are all kinds of ways in which the council could and may well seek to constrain that new commitment to making it more accessible to all citizens in Sheffield. So that is a really positive commitment, and I think it is a step change, and I think we should be proud of that, and I think that should be absolutely upfront, more upfront than it is now. I think the weakness in the report generally is that it's not seeing public questions as part of a system. I mean, I think Ruth Milson raised this. It's not seeing public questions as part of a system of involvement engagement. It's still very much dealing with them on their own as separate. And why this becomes important is because Sheffield City Council has more public questions than any other council in the country. And in some ways, you could say that that's a really good thing. That shows how many citizens and groups are engaged and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, I think it could also show that the council is not responsive enough to participation, and there aren't other opportunities, perhaps much more appropriate opportunities for people to participate in all the kind of different kinds of forums that exist and that people don't know about and so on. And we just stack up this bank of, often concerned, alarmed, even angry citizens coming at you with our public questions month after month after month. And there's something about seeing public questions as part of our system of involvement and engagement, and where there may be much better connections to have, other than piling up this stream of resentment through the performative and formal and limited engagement of public questions. So that's the weakness. I do have many comments on the technical aspects, and there's a lot that goes on in the background that members may not be fully aware of, the back and forth between citizens and people getting refused to ask their questions and negotiating over wordings and timings and so on. And so I would like to come back in writing, if it's okay, to officers in line with the survey you've got, on where I can see some of the real technical problems that are going to act to constrain people more and more and more in terms of asking questions. But those are just my general comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. I think there's lots to agree with there, absolutely, about citing this within a bigger piece of work around how our citizens can engage with the council, and not only through public questions and petitions, which for all sorts of reasons is always going to be a limited way to have those kinds of conversations and really take on board your comments around disability as well. John?
Thank you, John Johnson. A couple of things here. I'll try and get them in some order. Firstly, very welcome this as a work in progress, and it's encouraging to see that it's happening, and it seems to be happening with such acceptance from everybody. That's absolutely brilliant. I would just say, it would be good to see it viewed a bit less, as Ruth says, a bit less as a confrontational process where, it's public questions that are there to cause a problem. As Ruth says, it needs to be part of a process of sorting out the reasons behind the questions and getting as detailed answers as possible to them. And that raises the question for me about 1.9, about how the consistency and quality of response is going to be monitored. I suppose there's not a lot more detail on that at the moment. That would be interesting to see in due course. Also, if this is going to be a kind of triage system for, with 6 days to look at the question, is there a mechanism for, if it's not a question that's particularly relevant for the committee that it's being submitted to, will there be a mechanism for that being directed maybe to a LAC or the right place for it to be asked, a more appropriate place to be asked, rather than just disallow it or whatever? I'm sure that won't happen. The other thing was just a comment on the 3 working days for urgent questions. Is it still possible to ask if there's a more pressing issue, such as the one that Simon mentioned earlier about emerging international issues? If there's something that's happening more pressing, can that still be asked, subject to the chair's discretion? What was the last one? I agree with Councillor Alston on the word limit rather than the time limit. But how is that going to be fed back to people? Is it going to be a sort of an online form with a limit to the words that you can submit? And if so, that could be exclusionary. But yeah, I think word limit's better. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to suggest, Laurie, do you want to come back on any of those questions? And then maybe we'll just get a brief indication, especially from members of the public, whether people are broadly in support of this approach, and that will just help us to move on to the next bit. Go on, Paul.
Thank you. Sorry to just labour the point. Just on a word count, which actually feels like quite a minor detail in the whole scheme of things. It would be difficult, if someone was to turn up with a few bullet points and were to speak naturally rather than having a pre-prepared speech. That would make things really difficult. And perhaps something like there will be a 1 minute time limit, which is about, I don't know how many words 1 minute is, but which is 60 to 80 words, for example. It probably isn't, but
Laurie, do you want to respond on those?
But just to say thank you, I've been making copious notes through that conversation, and I think this is part of the journey. Really, it's part of that challenge. It's probably the first time most people have seen these written down, other than in sort of different packages or in sort of slides and previous papers. So I think there's some really useful comments in there, which I think probably reflected the fact that we know we've got to do some of the extra detail underneath. So the comments around the word limit versus time limit is really helpful. And I take Councillor Alston's point really about you wouldn't want to see somebody placed under pressure in a meeting to rifle through a question, to pack it all in rather than being composed and considered. So I think we need to look at these things and try and make sure that they're kind of captured. We'll take the point away around urgency as well and have a look at that as part of the next set of proposals and talk to members around that. One of the other points as well, which I think Councillor Milsom and Ruth on screen also raised, this is part of that wider package, and this committee's got 2 other big pieces of work that it's going to move on to, really. One is around the participation piece of work, which we'll update on a little bit under the work plan item, which is really that more comprehensive piece, and there's almost like an unknown about how the council, if the council improves its approach to that, whether public questions is seen as just a single route in that, because actually citizens should have multiple opportunities to get involved in the work of the council. Similarly, on the remits piece of work, there's a pressure on all the policy committees, which I think we've all reflected in this room, and about that balance between making decisions, policy development and review as well as part of that. I think some of the things that Councillor Milson talked about are part of that flexibility around how a committee works, and and we've seen how we can work in this committee in there, but obviously our pressures on our agenda are different to a transport and the regeneration committee, for example. So there's something in the remit review about how we look at the flexibility within the committee system and how you create space for different approaches to policy making and decision making, and which we need to explore really, I think, and that will pick up some of Ruth Hubbard's comments, but also the ones that Councillor Middleton made as well.
Thank you. We'll move on to discuss the rest of the proposals, but it would be really helpful just to get an indication from people if they are broadly in favour of these changes, subject to some of the tweaks that we've discussed, and especially members of the public. I'm interested to see if you are broadly in favour. I'm seeing nods, looking on screen as well. That's nearly a nod. Okay, we'll take on board those comments. Laurie, do you want to perhaps go through the next 4 sets together, I think? Is that okay, rather than one by one? And because I think these are probably less controversial. Oh, thanks.
Thank you, Chair. So these are more of the sort of, the first one actually, I sort of deliberately didn't address Ruth Hubbard's comments in the last section, because really some of this falls into the accessibility points. And I think we've been quite clear from the start of this. There were some equality, diversity and inclusion implications about how we operate public questions, which do have some implications for different people with protected characteristics like care and responsibilities, people at work, people at school. That there are, if you've got to attend a public meeting at a specific time of day, that does create some barriers for people. So there are some flexibilities in here which hopefully will improve some of that. I think taking Ruth's comments, I think there are opportunities to carry on improving this, and I think there's a bit of learning by doing in some of this. And we should definitely talk to stakeholders and people like Disability Sheffield to constantly give us that challenge about how we can improve some of our accessibility routes, but other community groups as well, of course. As you'll see in here, so this section really sets out four big things. One is public questions to be presented on screen, as we're probably about to see in about maybe 10-15 minutes time. The second one is to enable a questioner to request that their question read out on their behalf, to enable citizens to submit a written question and request a written response without having to attend a meeting, but ensuring that is then part of that public record. And then finally, enabling anonymity in a public forum. And the point of that is that was raised through by a number of citizens in the consultation piece. That would mean that question would be anonymous in the public setting, but as part of the submission process, we would need to still require some name and contact details, just because of the example Ruth talked about, really, that there's back and forth between that questioner and the team. So it's really important we have that, but in the actual context, people can remain anonymous. I'll keep motoring through. So proposal 3 is around creating that open and transparent and clear process. And this came up multiple times, but also from officers and members as well as citizens, about people feeling that the process is complicated, that there's concerns about time taken to receive a response, and that people want to be able to check the impact of what's happened as a result of a public question, which is the "you said we did," which I think has been mentioned already this morning by Councillor Hurst, actually. So in here, there's 2 big bits. One is around developing a single portal to submit a public question. So in technical terms, this is probably more of a simple online form to enable people to submit it and indicate where they'd like that question to be heard and how. And then, but also creating a sort of wiring behind the scenes, so there's more of a tracker for us, so like essentially a more coherent database. Helps officers to manage that and members to manage and to see where they're getting to, but also in a public context, people have to check where that question's got to and what the response is, and find it in a more navigable way. Proposal 4 is around improving advice and guidance, and I think this was a really clear message. Lots of people responded to this public survey we did. Actually hadn't asked a public question. Clearly there's been lots of involvement from people who're very experienced in asking public questions, but because we shared this via the Council's Gov Delivery and Chef News articles, lots of citizens participated and said they didn't know a lot about asking public questions, and they hadn't used the system as a consequence, and probably wanted to know more. There is a risk with some of the proposals in here that we increase complexity. So we're going to have to be very, very good at explaining to people how you can use that system and what different routes you can have a say. And this is part of that wider package of participation, but in specific terms around public questions, statements, verbal and written. And we're going to have to be quite clear about how you do that, where you do it, and what would be, and what's the outcome people are trying to achieve through that. So in here, we need to work on some clearer advice and guidance based on the work that we're proposing here. This will also include information about how people can get involved, how to submit petitions and questions, and also seeking advice from our comms professionals and stakeholders about how to best promote that as well. And I think there's a conversation with citizens about how to best promote that. The council broadcasting and talking about that being an important route is sensible, but there's also the networks we need to use to make sure people are aware of different routes into engaging with the council. And then just finally, the purpose of public questions, so adopting a clearer statement about, we have a clear part of the Constitution that refers to public questions and its role. As you'll have seen in the papers, there's a draft statement of principle about our approach to public questions, why we value it and why this is important. This connects to some of the work we've done on participation through this committee about recognising that importance of that experience for citizens, for members and officers as part of this, but an important route of part of Sheffield's democracy as well. So, and this will also ensuring that citizens have opportunities to feedback and be involved in that. And that connects to that point around undertaking the review at the end of the municipal year, so that we're clear that if we can keep iterating, developing the system and continuously improving it, as we said we'd do with the whole committee system, this is another part of that.
Thank you. Again, I'll take comments on any of those parts of the proposals. Paul?
Thanks, Fran. I don't mean to keep being first. I don't mind waiting if someone else would. Okay, so the only point that I wanted to comment on was 2.4 regarding anonymity. Now, I can picture several reasons why anonymity for a member of the public would be a good thing, but I could also think of reasons why it would be a bad thing for members, where we've had certain members of the public or certain councillors have had tormentors and persecutors, verging on stalkers, people who've been banned from public surgeries, and even perhaps our legal department and maybe even the police involved. And I wouldn't want those people to use the mechanism of anonymity to be able to continue their tormenting of individuals. And so, like I said, I do think it could be, it's really a good and valid thing in some circumstances. It could also lend itself to something which is a little darker and more negative. And I'm not 100% sure how that would be monitored. I think in most cases, if something was being targeted at an individual, they would probably know who that person was from the style or the content. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, for example, I'm not a chair of a committee. Somebody could ask a question of a chair, which would clearly be targeting me, and I wouldn't have seen that. I'm not afraid for my own safety, by the way, but it could be any member, and it could provide a mechanism for them to continue the tormenting.
Thanks, Paul. I think the idea around that is that no one would be able to submit a question anonymously, but once it is submitted, then they could be anonymous to the public, so it wouldn't be a matter of public record.
Sure, but I mean, I know of individuals who have several names and synonyms, and and AKAs. It's really quite common, and so unless they're going to be verified, which we've established, we can't really verify that any John Smith could be any person in the city or country.
Thanks. Any further comments, Simon?
Yeah, I just wanted to get a bit of clarity on what happens. So I've seen several situations times where somebody's put in a question and questions has gone on so long, or the petition perhaps that was before it has gone on so long that they've had to leave, and the chair or the Lord Mayor's gone, oh, is X here? And they've gone, no. So you'll get an answer in writing. And I think people want, I'm just wondering if the default is that if somebody doesn't turn up for whatever reason, that question will be read out and then the answer given, because that doesn't seem to be the case at the moment.
Thanks. Again, I think because people will have received an answer in writing ahead of the meeting. So is that about supplementary questions that you're asking that question, or is that about?
Well, no, I mean, I think for me, it was kind of, as a member of the committee or council, I'm kind of like, oh, I wonder what that question was. And so and people are asking questions because they want it asked in public, and then it doesn't actually end up getting asked in public for whatever reason. You know, say if they, can't make it or they're ill or what have you. And so, as I say, it just seems odd to me that sometimes somebody will have asked a question that they want to ask in public, and then, for reasons beyond their control, they couldn't make it. And I thought that was part of the accessibility to say, for me, I would want the default to be, well, okay, they're not here. They wanted this question asked in public. I will read it out. I mean, it is a bit kind of read out the question, read out the answer. But as I say, I didn't, so it's not clear here really whether or not that would be the default, because that, as I say, seems to be a lot of the motivation behind people wanting to ask the question is to raise awareness. And as I say, sometimes you're like, I wonder what that question was about, and you just don't know.
I'll invite officers to come back at the end, but I think one of the things we should be clear is that any questions that are asked and answered in writing will be on the public record, and that's part of the purpose of this. So even if they're not read out in a meeting or whatever, they will be published and part of the record of that meeting. Paul?
Thank you. Just on that, I mean, it is a good point, and I think there is something in here, so we discussed it about having your question read out, and it just occurred to me that, if you haven't got a mate with you in the gallery who's staying behind who can read it for you, that then who can you delegate your question, and how are we going to have a system of how that reading out of that question is delegated, or can they nominate someone? So, are we just going to say, right, it's always going to be the chair, or it's always going to be the legal counsel, or can they say, I want my ward councillor to read it out, or can they nominate, I'm not saying that I have an immediate answer to this, but I think that's just something that we ought to consider.
Thanks. I think that's all useful things to pick up as we continue to develop this system. John?
Yeah, just very quickly. The recommendations at part 4, Laurie, might be an idea to get a few people around the table to make sure that that's as inclusive as possible from the public point of view. Make sure it's reaching as many areas as possible.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any more hands. Sue?
Thanks, yeah, just really a couple of comments. I mean, I actually think that some of these points are actually more important even than the earlier stuff that I know we all got more interested in the technical stuff. I think the key about making sure that we keep that online tracker so people can see what happens to their question will greatly improve public satisfaction, I would hope. And also the recommendations in 4 to try and, make it more obvious to more people that is an option available to them. I share some of the concern, now it's been raised, about the making it clear to people for their options if they want the question read out, because I'd assumed it was going to be done by an officer, and I'd assumed that people would tick a box to say, no, I can't be there, so please read it out, or I will be there, but actually I don't want to read it out myself. But maybe we should have if you're not present, do you want, and just give people a few more options would strike me as the simplest way of doing it. But yeah, I think most of these points are really valuable, and I will be supporting them.
Thank you. Ruth on screen. Sorry, Ruth, could you just pause a minute? We just need to sort your sound out. You're very quiet. Just give us a second. Worked fine earlier, and now you're just coming through somebody's laptop.
Come back to Ruth in a minute.
we'll try and sort that out. Have I got any more comments in the meantime? Oh, we think we've sorted it. Try again.
Okay. I thought the principle was that people will be able to ask a question and that be seen, whether it's read or whether it's put on display or whether it's in the papers, whether or not they can attend. And I thought that was the principle. I see lots of problems between submitting a question 6 days in advance and getting your written reply, and it's there in the papers for the meeting. As for members' questions, as happens with members' questions, and the 3-day thing, I think I see lots of problems with that, and I see lots of possibilities for the council to say, council officers to say, oh no, we're not going to accept that question, and you might say, well, the papers only came out 12 hours before the 6-day deadline. So I think it's reasonable. And I'll say, no, the papers were out. You should have asked your question. We can't, we can't publish the answer or whatever. I see lots of opportunities for the council officers to constrain what is this new commitment to a right to ask questions, whether or not you can attend. I just wanted again to reiterate the principle of accessibility and enabling rather than the rules about constraining. Sorry, I wasn't very clear there, but I'll put it in writing anyway.
Thank you. I think there has been a real balancing act here between a lot of the feedback that we had around the quality of answers, so making enough time for officers to provide high quality answers and for politicians to see those, and balancing that with, you know, the time limit for the submission of questions, but we can by all means keep reviewing that and look at what is most effective for citizens.
Sorry, Fran, can I add? I still think the 6 days is a big ask when council papers often come out at the last minute, 7 days. I still think 6 days. And my suggestion would be that be pushed back to 5 days. You know, it's just such a short period of time to look at papers.
Thanks, absolutely take that on board, and that's something we can continue to review. So
such a short period of time to look at papers.
Sorry, Chair, my understanding was that if it was an item on the papers, that it's a 3-day time limit, not 6 days.
Do you want to clarify on this, Laurie, what we've...
Thank you, Chair. I'll just refer everybody back to paragraph or recommendation 1.2 in proposal on the appendix in proposal 1. So the 1.1 is about the 6-day six working days before a meeting around a written question, and then 1.2 is for questions that either couldn't reasonably be anticipated when the written question deadline, and things relating to specific agenda items as well. So I think that covers what Councillor Alston just said.
Yeah, and apologies, I think I was a bit unclear on that earlier. So, but yes, questions related to the agenda would have a 3-day deadline. Ruth.
Thank you, Chair. So, what it's saying here in the recommendation is the 3 working days, but a verbal response in the meeting, and that does risk then not having the opportunity for that dialogue element that would be possible if there's been a written answer before the meeting and then the questioner can come with a supplementary question. This is quite different, isn't it? And without wanting to sort of torpedo the time element of the public questions, I do think it's really important that there is a dialogue and that public questions automatically presume a dialogue, because I just think it's the most frustrating thing in the world for someone to put all that effort in to reading the papers, submitting a question, then coming and receiving an answer on the spot that may, you know, really legitimately engender a follow-up question, but that's not allowed. in the system. So don't think I have a magic answer for how that's managed time-wise, but I do think it's really, really important that there is an opportunity for dialogue.
Paul?
Thanks. I agree with Ruth, and I think that if there's going to be a verbal response, it's still a written response in the speaker's hand, isn't it? That written response could still be published along with the questions relating to 1.1, which are published online with the agenda, and then that would still fall into the same stream of us if somebody wanted to come and ask something or make a statement.
Yeah, I mean, these are all tricky things that we need to balance because, of course, to have a dialogue, there needs to be an ability to answer, and there may not be the information available at that point or that quickly to be able to give an answer to the follow-up question, unless you can push it really further back. And so it may need further work by officers to be able to answer those. And I think that's why a dialogue can be difficult in those circumstances, in that the member standing there may not have the relevant information to be able to answer immediately. And we've got to think about the capacity to answer these by having a question and then an answer and then a follow-up with a further written, which will appear in the minutes. For every question, we're potentially doubling the work within the council, and we've got to think of the capacity to be able to properly answer questions. So I think we do need to be answering people's questions, but we've got to not give a false promise of how quickly we can turn things around and the capacity within the council to be able to do this.
Thanks. At the risk of interrupting the dialogue, and I can see more hands flying up over there, we've got a couple more people who want to contribute here.
Jenny Carpenter from the Climate Alliance. I do think if this question is asked on something which is on the agenda, it would be much more helpful if that question could be put at the point when that agenda item is being discussed, and the person could actually have some interaction in that discussion. I've been in a number of council meetings where, you know, that would have been extraordinarily helpful, and some sort of answer has already been given, which may not have been very satisfactory. And sometimes it's pointed out, you may get more help for this answer, more helpful answer, if you listen to the discussion. But I think it would be wonderful if, when it was appropriate, the member of the public could actually share in the discussion on the item. And this is particularly true of committees. And you'll be aware of the one that I'm particularly concerned about, which is transport, regeneration and climate, where there is not very much public involvement, and there should be. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, and we will demonstrate that principle for the next item on the agenda. I've got Diane, followed by Ruth on the screen.
Thanks, Fran. Yes, I think we're in danger of getting caught up in all the process, and I think we're doing this with the best of intentions and open intentions to create a process which is certainly better than it is now, but certainly encourages people to ask questions and enter into a dialogue and to be able to see the outcomes of that. And I do think, particularly with Jenny, because I know Jenny's been to track meetings when I've been there in the past, and when you're at committee meetings, it's very much at the discretion of the chair. And there is no chair that's going to say, oh no, you've had your question, sit down, shut up. It may be that, you know, that there is a supplementary question that prompts, well, I wouldn't as a chair, and I know I've been in meetings where that's not happened. Chairs do take the most effort, in my experience, to make the meeting make as much sense and to be as productive as possible. And I think that ought to be part of the, if it's not part of the training that we give to chairs, then it ought to be. Because asking questions in a block when we're going to discuss something 25 minutes later and you've had your chance at questions and there's no chance of a follow-up, it's not. So can't we take the point as heard and received and take it forward in discussions? Because I don't believe there's any intent to block very important comments or prompts or aids to discussion that members may have. But the other pressure on committees is to organise it so that we get through the business, and it's as understandable as it is to the people that are in the meeting as the ones that are dialing up from online. So there has to be some organisation there as well. So it may be that the dialogue at the beginning comes, can we take your question as part of the agenda item? And can we just leave it as heard and received, and that we will go away and be mindful of that? I know I can see Laurie typing away and making notes.
Thank you. Bringing Ruth on screen.
My understanding from this paper was that if you came and asked a 3-day question to which you get a verbal answer, you would absolutely then be in a position of being able to ask a follow-up question. You know, I'm sorry, you haven't really answered my question, or you didn't cover this aspect. That was my understanding from reading this paper, and this is a good example of what I said before, of how one seeks to, the machine seeks to put endless constraints and limits. And it's I think it's very, very important, a very important innovation, the follow-up question, which many councils have, and that should be able to be put, whether the questions have come in 6 days in advance, or whether they are asked on an agenda item and getting a verbal answer. And that was my understanding from this paper. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll bring Ruth Milsom back in.
Thank you, all there is. David, as General Counsel, commented that it's important that there's an answer to that supplementary. Actually, I don't think it's that important that the Council has the final word. I think it's fine, actually, for the member of the public to speak and not be responded to instantly. I don't think it's crucial at all, and that should certainly not be a block to a member of the public speaking and expressing their opinion or asking another question. And I think the most vital thing is that that person's voice is put on the record on that date, and they don't have to wait another 2 months in the committee cycle to ask a follow-up question. Really vital. I would really absolutely put a red line on that.
Thank you. I'm going to suggest that we wind up the discussion there. Again, it'd be good just to get a quick indication if people are satisfied with the broad proposals 2, 3, 4 and 5, which cover things like accessibility and the process, the tracking system, etc. People broadly in favour of those proposals. We know we've got some work to do on tightening up some of the technical details. Again, looking at members of the public in particular, seeing thumbs up. Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to take the members of the committee now then through the actual recommendations on this item. Oh, sorry. Go on, Laurie.
I was just going to just say thank you, one, for that conversation. We've been making notes, I know Alice has as well, and Jason. We'll bring all that back together for the 27th of March meeting. I think that's been really helpful, and actually don't forget that is part of the journey on this. We have to have that dialogue in this space and with citizens as well. I think there's also something we need to land this, and the way we craft the recommendation and the proposals afterwards, and land the point that public questions are a really important part of how we do business through the committee system, through the council, but they're one element of a much broader spectrum of activity and interaction here, and they're quite a. It's not necessarily always feels like a dialogue. It's quite two-way or quite I don't know, staged in some settings. And we need to get better at some of the things that Ruth on screen has talked about, and Councillor Middleton in the room, about how that forms part of a wider kind of piece around citizen involvement, which should be richer than something in this sort of setting, really. So we need to land it as part of a demonstration of our ambitions to get better at this stuff, but it's one element of that. So let's not lose that focus as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. Apologies for cutting across that. So we'll go through the recommendations on this item, which are, first of all, to thank citizens and stakeholders for their contributions to the review of public questions and petitions, to consider and comment on the draft proposals to reform public questions and invite contributions from citizens who wish to participate in the discussion at the committee, to invite citizens and stakeholders to provide feedback on the current draft proposals by the 6th of March 2024, which is via the survey we've mentioned, and to agree to receive a final draft set of proposals at the next meeting of the Governance Committee on the 27th of March. Can I check that everyone's in favour of those proposals? Everyone in favour. Thank you. Yep.
Well, okay, quickly, the question then. Point 4, to receive a final draft. Slight contradiction for me in my mind of it being final and a draft. And I just wonder what we're meaning with that. Is that we're going to, is it a draft or is it the final report?
I think we have in the past amended things at committee, so although it will be a final version, if you like, it will still be a draft because we might amend it at the committee, but that's what I'm assuming we'll do, and then that is what would go forward as our recommendation to full council.
Councillor Turpin obviously doesn't realise how many drafts we go through before we get to a final draft.
There's a final draft and a final version. Can I say a huge thank you to everybody who's contributed to the discussion, and members of the public, you are absolutely welcome to stay for the rest of the meeting, though do not feel obliged if you don't want to. We're next, John, do you want to?
Yeah, sorry to say, we're still in public questions. Before we move on, it's just it's not so much a question; it's more an observation for the Governance Committee, just with regard to the offer that was made in the council chamber some time ago to the leader of the council for citizens to be involved in consultation processes. With reference to the consultation up at Dunkeld and Silverhill, that's an offer which, if it had been taken up, would have avoided an awful lot of egg on faces and an awful lot of aggro. So just to make the point that those offers are still there, and people do want to get involved in making these processes easier rather than having to then go back and rework and apologise for things. I'll just place that on record.
Thank you, that is noted. We'll make sure that's fed back via the appropriate routes. I'm going to take us on now to what was item 9 on the agenda originally, which is about member role profiles. What I propose to do here is take the officer's report first, and then Ruth, I will take your public questions on this issue following the officer report. So sorry, it's Jason to present on this.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair. Just a brief introduction to this. This work on councillor role profiles came out of the governance review implementation plan that we put together, and it was part of explaining and improving how we explain the system and having clearer guidance on the roles and responsibilities, particularly for chairs, deputy chairs and group spokespersons. The purpose of the report is to adopt the first of the 4 role profiles that the Member Development Working Group has been working on, and they're appended to the main report, which has been published. So that's for the City Councillor role, the Policy Committee Chair, the Deputy Chair of the Policy Committee, and the group spokesperson. The working group recognise that each individual councillor might tackle a role differently, and they might have their individual ways, obviously, of approaching a role. So the profiles are intended to be an overview of the purpose and roles and responsibilities of a role, and to get into some discussion around the skills needed, so we can inform the member development programme. So they're not a definitive guide, but they are definitely, it's an overview. The purpose of the role profiles, there's several of them, is to make it clearer to everybody what's expected of the role. So that could be a member of the public, an officer, members who want to be put forward to one of those roles, guidance for the independent panel for members' allowances scheme. So when they undertake a review of the scheme, they'll bear in mind the role profiles and it informs their thinking. It supports elected members in their developments and provides a checklist of their learning and development needs. And that might include roles that they're currently undertaking or actually where we have succession planning and members are looking to perhaps take a role in the future. It provides information for prospective candidates about the responsibilities of a councillor, and it informs our priorities for member development at the programme for the year. Just to say that the role profiles, they're guidance documents, they are separate by and large from the Code of Conduct and the Constitution. There is one exception, which is in relation to Article 7 of the Constitution, which relates to the role of the Policy Committee Chair, that we'll talk about today, is in the paper. There's one of our recommendations. There are other role profiles and developments, so we've got one for local area committee chair and other roles as well. So the member development working group is working on those, and we'll bring those to a future meeting of the governance committee. So that's it. Thanks, Chair. I'd like to say thanks to the working group for all their work on this, and particularly to Rachel Appleyard in my team for her work on putting them together. So thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Ruth, would you like to ask your questions at this point? I suggest you ask one by one, and then we can reply to each of them as we go, and hopefully the discussion that then ensues will also add further, I think, to some of your questions.
Thank you. It's a 5-part question, you're right, so you want to take each separately. And it might be interesting to reflect on this, whether this would meet the requirements or limitations that you may want to impose on public questions in new arrangements. But anyway, here we go. I would like to note that I strongly support the proposal that group spokespersons receive a special responsibility allowance. And I'd also ask for comment on what might be omissions or weaknesses, as below. A, there is no mention anywhere of roles or responsibilities in relation to LACs or how they fit. This seems odd when, as I recall, LAC arrangements have their own section in the Constitution too.
Thanks.
Did you want me to stop there, Fran?
Yeah, I'll respond to them one by one. Probably makes more sense, I think. We are producing a new role profile for the role of LAC Chair, and we will take the opportunity to think about the role of all councillors in relation to local area committees. At the moment, the councillor role profile doesn't specifically mention local area committees or any specific committees by name, but there is a strong emphasis, I think, on elected members' roles in their communities as representative and advocate on how they should build relationships with residents and other organisations. There's some quotes in here. We'll send you this in writing as well. I won't read out all the quotes from the role profiles, or we'll be here for quite some time, but there's some examples, I think, in the written answer you'll receive. One of our points of reference for this work was the 21st century councillor work that has been done, and that really emphasises the role of councillors being strongly rooted in their wards and communities and working in partnership. And again, I'd say these role profiles are not designed to duplicate or replace sections of the Constitution. So yes, the relationship with LACs is set out in the Constitution, but the role profiles are more about providing links to the procedures in terms of reference that are set out in the Constitution, and the option to refer to other committees and decision-making bodies without being specific. And we have tried to keep the role profiles independent of each other so that they remain fit for the future, regardless of any future changes in committee arrangements, for example. Do you want to move on to your next question?
Yes, B. There is one mention of equalities, if one looks closely. There's a pretty passive one at that, alongside a bunch of other things in relation to following policy. Can't and shouldn't we do a bit better than this?
Thank you. Each role profile does include, in the very first point, about adherence to the councillor code of conduct, the council's equality policies and council values, and I think there's a reason that is number one, and that we expect the code of conduct to pick up a lot of the issues around equalities, upholding the 7 principles of public life, etc. And so I think we've expected the role that councillors have in relation to promoting equality and providing that environment free from harassment, etc., is within that code of conduct rather than in these. We have, however, considered the role of equalities throughout our discussions on the role profiles, and there is an equalities impact assessment attached to this that I think demonstrates how we've considered that. And also one of the purposes of the role profiles is to identify learning and development for member development activity and ensure that that's incorporated in the member development programme. We already include equalities training in our member development programme and in our induction programme, and we are currently supporting the rollout of a level 2 certificate in equality, diversity and inclusion for elected members. So I think we are taking it seriously. If we can move on to question 3.
Yes, it's C on mine. Scrutiny is mentioned simply as one of many responsibilities. It's my view that incorporating adequate scrutiny functions into the committee system is currently a bit of a weakness. And I think there's some evidence and examples that could be cited in relation to this. Should scrutiny be highlighted a little more? And because it's linked to the next point, Fran, I'm going to go on, if it's okay. This piece of work is mooted as being part of explaining the system to members of the public. However, nearly everyone will not plough through this level of detail. Could thought be given to an overarching or an executive short statements that might be used for basic explanatory purposes and emphasise the most important points, e.g. something like, councillors are elected to represent their ward areas. They liaise widely with local people, communities and groups or stakeholders, play an important role in council decision making and oversee, scrutinise and review council proposals and decisions, or something even pithier, actually.
Thank you. Again, I think it was acknowledged during the development of these role profiles that now that the committee system's in place, the responsibilities around scrutiny and policy development, it does need further work. So at the moment, the role profiles describe scrutiny as being part of every decision taken at a policy committee, and we do include a link to the Good Scrutiny Guide in the additional information and best practice guidance. Again, I won't read out the quote from the role profile here, but it will be in the written answer. We have already begun some work on a review of policy committee remits and set up a working group around that. And the scope of that work does very specifically include a review of the key responsibility of policy committees and whether they're being delivered effectively, including around policy review and scrutiny, policy development and decision making. So we will continue to work on that. And I think in relation to question D, as part of the governance review implementation plan, we are doing some work to review the information that's on the council website that will explain how the committee system works. So we can aim to include a short summary of councillors' roles as part of that review and the rewriting of those pages. As you've pointed out, there's a lot of information in the role profiles and the constitution about councillor roles. So the aim of these is really to add clarity and detail about what the roles entail in practice whilst trying to avoid duplicating existing information. And I think you've got one last question, E.
Yeah, under E. One of the complaints of people out on the streets of Sheffield when our city went out and about common complaints across the city was that when they contacted councillors, they received no reply, or even that when they went to a councillor surgery, the councillor wasn't even there. I note the emphasis on communicating with and responding to members of the public, and a variety of contact methods is mentioned. I know councillors can be extremely busy, but I'm concerned about over-promising and under-delivering, which just fuels scepticism and discontent. This isn't necessarily a suggestion for the role profiles, but can I make a plea, in practice at least, that councillors that have at least one very reliable method of contact, whatever that might be, perhaps over and above imagining they might be able to be everywhere doing everything all the time in relation to public contact. It's a plea for reliability rather than we're doing, you know, masses of methods.
Thank you for making the point. You'll know probably that councillors do have methods of contact listed on the council website that will usually include an email address and a telephone number and possibly surgery details, etc., of where people can be found in person. We do also have a telephone point of contact for all councillors, which is a town hall number, which is 0114 273 5380, if people don't know it. We can possibly better promote or advertise that, but that messages to that number are always picked up and relayed to the relevant councillor. Thank you for those, Ruth. We'll go on now and take any further contributions from councillors on the role profiles. I see Mike.
Thanks, Chair. On the other role profiles, could we just have a little bit of clarification on a couple of them? One just says subcommittee chair. Now, this is subcommittees that are put in place at AGMs and usually as a result of a subcommittee of a policy committee. Therefore, the policy committees will be preparing terms of reference for these. How is it possible to have a separate profile for a subcommittee when it's the terms of reference that determine what needs to be done? Thank you. That's the first question.
Thank you. I think there is a specific answer on that one. Do you want to take a few questions at once and then answer them at the end, Jason, if that's okay? Have you got more questions, Mike?
Yeah, second one's about scrutiny committee chair and a general comment about scrutiny. I'm presuming this is referring to health scrutiny alone. We don't have any other scrutiny committees that I'm aware of. I think it needs to say that because we, in response to what Ruth talks about, the whole objective of a committee system was to have mechanisms for pre-scrutiny to make sure that when decisions are made, they're made in full knowledge of what's involved. So, for example, this is why we have briefings of spokespersons, so they can ask questions and clarification, and why, when it comes to committee, we also have questions raised, so that we're not in a position, as we were under the old system, of having scrutiny committees after the event, after the decision's made, and discussing it. So, I think the processes are in place for that to happen, and I just wanted to make that comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Laura?
I think I'd just like to make a plea for a difference between existing skills and member development. Somebody looking at that who might be interested in becoming a councillor or whatever could be easily put off. And I've seen this in applicants for jobs who have got the key skills but don't know they've got the key skills. So yes, we do want people with core skills, but it's how we bring that on and how we don't put people off from wanting to become a councillor in the first place. And I think that, you know, that applies sometimes to particularly to certain groups. And so there's a balance whether people have got the potential through member development to develop the whole range of skills and whether they've got core competencies. So I don't know how we draw that out, but it can look quite off-putting to people.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you, Chair. Just to follow a little bit from what Councillor Lavery just said about, so that there are other roles under development work with the member group. I fit into both categories there, Mike, so I can answer a little bit. So as a scrutiny chair, yes, health scrutiny is the only scrutiny committee formally in place, and it's also a subcommittee. Now, health scrutiny sits a little bit outside of the council processes in a way, in that it's scrutinising an outside body, the NHS. So it is a statutory function in itself. It has been set up as a subcommittee, so that, to me, that creates a little kind of weird cross-fertilisation that isn't necessarily helpful, but that's how it's fallen into the committee system as a subcommittee of adults and children's, in fact. So the members of that committee are drawn from those parent committees, but actually there's no particular reporting back function because it's scrutinising an outside body. So it is a bit peculiar, that one, and you have to sort of understand how, you know, what its function is really. But as for the role of scrutiny within the committee system, this is something that, again, we've worked on very hard in Adult Health and Social Care Policy Committee, and I've been pushing that from day one, recognising that it's part of the committee system, but it wasn't really, I don't think, a dramatically upfront part of the remit that councillors were served with when the committee system began. It was something that councillors who have been around for longer know is part of the function of the council and part of their responsibility, but newer members might not have realised that. So we've worked very hard in our committee, and I'm sure other committees have as well, to make sure that scrutiny function is fully built in. And yes, it happens at the pre-briefings, and a lot of it does involve sensitive information, so it's not suitable for a public forum anyway. And we've in fact in Adults just set up a monitoring advisory board, which is a very informal subcommittee type set up of the parent committee, in order that we can ensure we are regularly looking at those scrutiny functions. So that, you know, I think it is happening, it's just not necessarily the same across the board in all the policy committees. So I mean, I would definitely encourage every policy committee to look hard at how it's exercising the scrutiny function and whether it's formal enough.
Thank you, Ruth. I'll bring David in on that point as well.
I think it depends on what you mean by scrutiny. So Mike is correct that overview and scrutiny, as we used to have, is no longer there other than in the statutory functions. And the word scrutiny doesn't appear in relation to policy committees other than that. But, oh, Ruth's gone. If I can channel Ruth Hubbard in what she said in other forums, scrutiny can mean a lot of other things. And it is just a normal English word, as well as meaning that overview and scrutiny function, which we don't have. And I don't think that's picking up on Ruth Milsom's point, as opposed to Ruth Hubbard's point, that actually there is within that function of policy committees a small s scrutiny role. And I think that is something that this committee itself is going to look at in the future as well. So I think those role profiles need to be looking at that context, but also recognising that this committee is going to look at that further anyway in due course.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. So a couple of things. Firstly, can I just make a minor textual amendment? The spokesperson is being asked to promote and uphold the standards, whereas the deputy chair is only being asked to promote the standards of Councillor Code of Conduct. Is that okay to make a minor textual, so that they both promote and uphold?
Well, I think they should be both promoting, because I don't think they've got a formal role in upholding, because actually that falls to...
Is that your job, isn't it?
Partly, yes.
Okay, just a bit of pedantry.
But you're right, they should be
love
consistent.
A bit of that, don't we?
Yeah.
No, so I would also like to speak about scrutiny as well, and just say that the policy committees with 9 members each replace an individual cabinet member, and policies are supposed to be developed and scrutinised by the whole committee from start to finish. And if they're not, I would encourage members to not vote for them when it comes to the vote in the policy committee. You know, for example, look, this item and the previous item, we've spent hours on them behind the scenes, you know, together, working cross-party to produce these reports. And that's how it should work in every committee, policy committee or otherwise. And like I said, if members don't feel that they've had reasonable and sufficient input into the development and scrutiny, then they should not be supporting them when it comes to the vote. And I would also like to add that under our previous system with the strong leader model and the cabinet member, scrutiny was not very good. It was bad. You could not call every decision for scrutiny, for starters. And even when you did get something at the scrutiny committee, it made no difference if the committee had disagreed with it. It was more likely that if the committee were to make a recommendation that the cabinet member would ignore it and carry on as it were anyway. So that it wasn't brilliant before. It is better the way it is now, but it just needs to be done better by the individuals. You know, maybe it doesn't need to be done better, but individuals need to be satisfied that what's happening in their committee is good.
Thanks, Paul. I will take Mike, and then I'm going to propose that we let Jason feedback as we have another substantive item on the agenda. I'll take a small contribution from Sue as well. Thank you. Mike?
Yes, just to comment on that. I think the objective of briefings with spokespersons is for the spokespersons then to go back to their group, if necessary, and brief them, and use policy Bs as a mechanism as well, so that when it comes to the meeting, everybody at the meeting should be well briefed on what the position is from their respective group. And I think those mechanisms are working, certainly for us, and I think that's the way it should work. Thank you.
Sue?
I'm going to go back to the subject, which is these roles. And I must have stared at these so many times because sitting on the working group. So just two brief comments. Firstly, following up on Ruth's comment, which I think it was Ruth's comment. It might be Laura's comment. I apologise about the skills. And I do think maybe just under the skills, instead of saying the following skills will support a city councillor, maybe we need to say, you know, these are skills that councillors may wish to develop and should training should be provided to support them. So that's not very good actual wording, but I think maybe that should just be explained a bit better. And I'm sorry we didn't pick up on that in the working group because we should have done really. And my other question, which may be really silly, but on the first box on the page 66, under the skills required, it says leadership, listening, empathy, emotional. And I'm not entirely sure what emotional is. Whether it's meant to say emotional intelligence, I don't know, but it's either a typo or an error.
Thank you. I'll ask Jason to come back on those. Thanks.
Thanks everybody. Yeah, so to first come back on the point about skills, I think we'll look at the wording on that box. Thanks, Councillor Alston, for that. And I think we could look at the wording about that there's a member development role here, and people might not be full and ready to start a role, and they might need some development. We are doing a skills audit and a questionnaire and survey for members as part of that, so I think that's partly to find out what people would like to learn and where they feel their strengths are, and part of that was to discover talents and actually for us to sort of be aware of those, so we're not sort of putting our member development focus in the wrong place. And I think that's people should be sort of confident of that coming in. There is a place for doing individually tailored discussions with members as well. So if someone has just joined the council and they have particular needs, I think that's important. So I think this is about supporting particularly new councillors and councillors who are new to a role. So if they're new to chairing a committee or something like that, part of this is not meant to be, if it looks daunting on this list, it is actually meant to be supportive, and we'd be supportive in the way we actually do that for people. I do take that point. The point, I think we discussed the point about scrutiny, that's what been covered. The subcommittee role, so at the moment we have a charity subcommittee in the council, so that would be the example that we'd look at, and I think it's something that the working group can take away, how far we can actually make a generic role description for that, or actually are we basing it on what we know, which is the existing committee, which is the charity subcommittee, and we have a separate profile for the health scrutiny committee as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. I'll go through the recommendations on the basis. I think everybody was happy with the small suggestions to tweak these, weren't they, there, that have been made during the course of that. Any objections to? That's fine. So subject to those small amendments. The recommendations are to review and provide any final comments on the 4 role profiles, to adopt the 4 role profiles and recommend to full council that Article 7 in the Constitution be updated as set out in Appendix B, role of the Policy Committee Chair, to request the Director of Policy and Democratic Engagement, in conjunction with the Member Development Working Group, to identify the priority areas for member development activity arising out of the role profiles and ensure these are incorporated in the Member Development Programme, to identify any further roles which City Councillors perform for which role profiles might be developed in the future and to produce those for future consideration, and to note that the Independent Remuneration Panel will undertake a review of members' allowances and to request that the panel has regard to the new role profiles when reviewing the allowances and considers whether the role of group spokesperson should be awarded a special responsibility allowance. Can I see if everyone, is that a hand up? Are you making a final point here, Paul? I'm sorry, I'm going to move us on because I've already read the recommendations. We've got an officer waiting to do another item that we've got to get through.
I know, I'm sorry, Chair. I should have brought it up earlier. It's just that the part 1.10, the 2 further issues which were considered, that we began the discussion in our last meeting and we didn't develop them, so I just wondered about those 2 points, balancing a budget and chairing the committee. How are we, I mean, it seems almost pointless having them in the report unless we're going to plan to do something with them.
Sorry, I can't quite find those points. I thought, though, that we'd already agreed they were covered within the role profiles by existing points, that they have been covered within the. I can see Sue nodding. Within the City Councillor profile, it makes specific reference around that. So I think they have been, and we did deal with that. I'm going to move us on to the vote. I think we concluded
it, but I'm happy to move on, Chair.
Okay.
I said I don't think we concluded it, but I'm happy to move on because I feel like I'm probably on my own anyway.
Thank you. Is everyone in favour of those recommendations? Yes. Thank you. Right, I will now move us on then to item 8 and invite Joe, if you'd like to come up to present on this. So this is the item on governance to support partnership working with the NHS and other partners across Sheffield.
Thank you. So I'm Jo Horrobin, Director of Integrated Commissioning, and I'm just going to give you a quick summary of the report and the process and the context for the proposals included in it. The report summarises the outcome of the Task and Finish group that was established by this committee last year to consider appropriate Sheffield City Council membership of the Health and Care Partnership Board. And I'll provide a little bit of context for the recommendations that are set out at page 44, in particular the importance of member involvement in this partnership. And now my laptop has just decided this is the opportune time to time out. 1 second, please. Bear with me. Okay. So the Sheffield Health and Care Partnership, the HCP, was founded in 2017, and it's an alliance that brings together the council with health providers and commissioners and the voluntary sector in order to focus on health and care issues that can really only best be addressed together and through the effective use of pooled resources. The Council has been an active member of the Healthcare Partnership since its inception, in fact, before its inception, with political and senior officer engagement in strong collaboration and joint working since the Better Care Fund was launched in 2013, and ongoing through the evolution of governance over the last 10 years, which I won't drag you through, but which I'm happy to take questions on. With more recent changes to the Council's governance following the referendum in 2021 and to the NHS following the Health and Care Act in 2022, the NHS in Sheffield, with council officers and members, has worked to develop new governance arrangements to meet the requirements of both the local context and that tradition of collaboration in the city and new national legislation. And throughout that time, work has been ongoing to ensure that we continued with joint commissioning and joint planning, and that work is now reported into the Healthcare Partnership Board, underpinned by a suite of delivery groups. The Task and Finish group of this committee met to look at how elected members might best engage in this evolving partnership space, because it is still an evolving space. We are continuing to learn, really, and develop the partnership. And the report provides recommendations on how the current gaps regarding a sustainable approach to member engagement in that space should be addressed. I think it's just important to emphasise that as well as discussing the criteria and mechanics of elected members becoming members of the Health and Care Partnership Board, the Task and Finish group reflected a lot on the purpose of the relationship between the Council and NHS partners and the voluntary sector in this space, and the potential benefits of elected member involvement, with a real importance of supporting the right things to happen for Sheffield, and setting local priorities around health and well-being, while being aware of national policy and priorities. There was consensus that I really wanted to emphasise across members of the Task and Finish group and the local NHS representatives who worked with us, that member engagement in the Health and Care Partnership represents a positive opportunity to develop closer working, and emphasises the importance of making a success of the relationships in this space. It was also recognised that community voice is hugely important, and that elected members often have unique insight into communities and individuals' lives through your casework, which in turn can help people's voices to be heard and amplified in the health and care arena. So the Task and Finish group met 4 times and developed a set of recommendations that are set out at page 44 and cover 5 key areas. The process for appointing members to the Healthcare Partnership, which the proposal is should be via the member appointment process in the Council's AGM. The principles that should guide the appointment of members to the Healthcare Partnership. Key points for a draft role description. Member development priorities in order to support effective and impactful engagement in that partnership space. And finally, the principles for ways of working and the support needed for members from officers. I'll stop there. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jo, and thanks to all the officers and members who took part in that Task and Finish group. Can I see any questions or comments on this? Paul?
Thanks, Jo. It was a good, if not at times arduous, process to get through to this. And but yeah, it's all good. The only thing that I wanted to ask about is that during our discussions, I think it was estimated by colleagues that it would be a time commitment of something like 16 hours a month. Yet there's no mention in the report of a special responsibility allowance for that. So I think I'll certainly be putting forward an amendment, Chair, to ask the Independent Remuneration Panel to look at that.
Any other comments? Ruth?
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Jo, for presenting the report. I think this is potentially a really exciting space, and we all agreed on that, didn't we, in the working group? I want to comment on the importance of community-based health creation when we talk about everything to do with healthcare, is to get that mindset out of acute care and into prevention, what we call prevention, which is a very sort of clinical word for what we actually mean about everyday lives and everything that contributes to a healthy life. And the NHS long-term plan, I keep going back to it, and the priorities that it set out for enabling everyone to get the best start in life, helping communities to live well, helping people to age well. Those were 3 priorities that were absolutely core through that long-term plan of the NHS from 2019. And I feel that the NHS itself, and I'm not pointing the finger at a local level or practitioners at all, but rather much higher up the food chain in the NHS nationally, I feel it's spectacularly failed to deliver on those priorities, and that actually work that happens effectively in that space is currently very much down to voluntary sector and local authority partners and community volunteers who are often completely unseen, and unpaid carers in the system. And I think, I mean, I've yet to meet a councillor or MP or voluntary sector leader or healthcare practitioner who doesn't think we should be shifting resources massively into prevention and health creation. But I think at this point in time, we're really reliant on the NHS part of the partnership to help us make that happen. So I think I want to emphasise the part of the report that's about looking beyond Section 75 of the Health and Social Care Act, which is very confining, really. It's the Better Care Fund, it's a pooled fund of money between local authority and NHS, and yes, that has to be done really well, but I think there's just a whole realm beyond that. And I was really glad that we discussed that on the working group about looking well beyond that very formalised agreement and into being creative and influential in really quite urgently expanding the preventative side of healthcare and how community-based that is. So I'm really excited about the outcome of this, and that a refreshed health and care partnership that has more elected member involvement, and hopefully we can really work together with the NHS partners and exert some influence in that space. Very hopeful.
Thank you. Any further contributions, Sue?
Yeah, just a very short comment and then a short question. Firstly, I just want to say a big thank you to yourself and the other people who were involved in actually organising that working group. It wasn't an easy get through because there was a lot of background information, and I thought you structured it and organised it really, really well, and I think the proposals we've come up with are really useful and a good way forward. My question is just about process, so I'm sure somebody can answer it straight away. Will this recommendation be going to full council for agreement? My concern is that it needs to go sooner rather than waiting for the AGM, because if we sort of need this information for groups to allocate people to those roles starting in May. And if that allocation is to be done at the AGM, we sort of need that information in place beforehand. So I'm just really asking about process for getting this in place. Thank you.
Sorry, the information regarding to...
So there's quite a lot of information here about what the job entails that we will need to talk to members about before telling them you're on this committee. So I'm just trying to look at process and timings about when it will be formally agreed this is going to happen, and when that information can be shared with, we can start looking at allocating things.
I'm not sure, Jo, what's the timescales for this coming in?
So I think the intention was that we would want to be able to share information such as role profiles and background information on the partnership, the expectations, some of the history with parties before May, in order that informed decisions and appointments can be made.
Because I'm not sure, I'm just thinking aloud here, I'm not sure there's actually any particular constitutional changes we might need to make to this. This will be an appointment by full council, so I don't think it needs anything beyond today for us to start sharing that information.
That's great. I mean, that was what I was sort of trying to clarify. In which case, I will ask Jo if she can sort of, assuming that we agree this today, if she can make sure that the group leadership for each of the political groups is aware of it as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Any further questions or comments on this paper? I will come to your point in a minute, Paul. Joe, is there anything you wanted to comment in terms of the questions or comments that have been raised? Thank you very much for your time. Paul, then can we clarify what you're proposing here? Are you proposing that the council should consider an SRA, or that this should go to the IRP, or are you looking to the health service? What exactly are you looking for here?
Well, I think it should be paid. I'm asking that that's considered by whichever is the appropriate body. I'm not sure, but perhaps David can advise if it would be the IRP or if it would be somebody else who would who could look into that.
Ultimately, all allowances and SRAs are approved by full council, and they do that at the AGM. That usually is a recommendation from the IRP that they consider before doing that. What I would say is that we don't have any SRAs for any external appointments at the present time. And if we were going to look at whether external appointments should have IRPs, that probably needs to be done in the round, and there would be financial considerations for that. I think the comment that Franz just made about maybe health could, whether health feel that there could be SRAs paid, is probably a relevant one that we might be able to pick up. Whether health, some external appointments, the bodies that people are appointed to, there are SRAs associated with that aren't paid by the council.
Could we amend it to ask that they look at that then, because it is quite a significant time commitment, and it certainly discourages diversity and equality when we're obliging people to take on quite a lot of work and responsibility unpaid, when you know, obviously that would mean more likely that somebody who can afford to do it will take up the role and prevent someone who can't. Sorry, Fran, I was going to say, but I think they would need to consider whether there are other external appointments made by the council that may have similar time commitments that you might make the same argument for, and whether appointing SRAs to external appointments would be something new, and if we were taking that principle, we'd need to apply that to all the external appointments that the council does.
I'm going to leave that one there in terms of further discussion. I think Paul has made a proposal. Personally, I would agree with David's construction of it, that we should be, if we're going to look at that, we should look at everybody's roles, but I'll take a vote on Paul's proposal, which is that we just send this role for consideration to the IRP, I think. Yep. Can I see those in favour of doing that? And those against? Okay.
But could you just clarify, are we looking at two alternative approaches to taking that forward?
We will, I think, given that we voted against the proposal that we've just had, but we'll take away the wider point around looking at a wider approach to it. We'll take that away, but that's not for discussion here. We're already at midday and we do have a further item on the agenda, but we will come back to that. Thank you, Joe, for that. We do need to do the recommendations for this report, which are to endorse a proposal that places for elected members on the Health and Care Partnership should be added to the list of appointments to be made by full council, usually at the annual general meeting, guided in the first instance by the discussion set out in this paper. Agrees to receive a further report setting out revised terms of reference for the Health and Care Partnership, following work to review these later in 2024, with a view to these guiding appointments to the HCP board in the future. Endorses the development of a role description for elected members taking up places on the HCP board based on the points set out in this paper. Endorses the proposal that council officers should work with NHS colleagues to develop an appropriate induction process for elected members who are appointed to the HCP board, and develop a broader development package for elected members targeted at building understanding of the NHS and the council's relationship with it, and endorses the proposal that officers should consider the best supporting arrangements for elected members based on the comments of the Task and Finish group, building in capacity to develop these to reflect future learning. Is everyone happy to accept those proposals? Thank you. Okay, we'll move on then to item 10 on the agenda, which is the work plan. And I believe, Alice, you are presenting this. Thank you.
I am, thanks, Chair. Yeah, page 81, you've got 3 basic recommendations. Most of this report, the preliminary stuff, is fairly familiar to you all from members of other committees. I think what's important to note is that you need to keep perhaps looking at the work programme in Appendix 1, which is page 84 of the report pack. And I've used that as a way of updating what's happening on each of your areas of work. And I'll quickly go through that. You'll notice the first one, Governance Review Implementation Plan, refers to a document A, which those of you who have actually looked in detail will see it's still dated November 2023. And in a way, things haven't moved on much from that, in that what we would put on those key points. However, the work in progress, what's going on, there's been a lot going on, I think, behind the scenes, and the other pieces of work that you're deeply involved in as a committee, but not a lot out there publicly yet. So I think it's fair to say that also the government's review implementation plan, in a way, is a couple of years old. So I don't think we should be shy as officers, and I don't think you as members of this committee should worry that there's what appears to not be massive progress, but there is a lot going on, as you know, from all the work that you're involved in, which comes on afterwards. So the next thing on there was the member development programme. You're very much working, the working group is on with that. There are various elements that those of you involved in the group are seeing, and they will be brought appropriately to committee. Am I right in saying that actually role profiles was sort of part of that work? So you're already seeing things in stages. The next one, Public Questions Task and Finish Group, fairly self-explanatory. You've had an item today. You know that something's going to come back, whether it's a final draft or whatever the terminology is. There will be something more that we've worked on for you to look at on the 27th of March. You've just heard the NHS governance and alignment work. I think the biggies that you're still very much involved in, and there's a lot of meetings going on quietly and scoping that we as officers have been asked to look at, is the citizen participation and community involvement, so your public involvement working group. There will be more, I think, to report to you in March with a bit more of a plan about what's actually happening on that. And then the other one is the review of policy committee remits, both of which you'll have heard from conversations this morning are related in a way to public questions. All of those 3 have a little bit of a link to them, and so that work is ongoing. The urgent decisions the date was revised, so I'm hopeful now that you will see something at the March meeting. And then on that list, you'll see 4 things that don't have a date to be confirmed yet. And I suspect, bearing in mind the time where we're at in the municipal year, and that there is only 1 more meeting scheduled of this committee, I think, this municipal year, it's unlikely any of those will be ready in time for you to see. But that's not to say that work isn't ongoing or hasn't been commissioned. And as I'm reliably informed, and I'm sure David Hollis can confirm that, say, for example, the charity subcommittee is part of a larger piece of work that will be reported later on in 2024. So we're at that stage of the year, I think, where you've got a good work programme. There's a lot been going on. There will be a lot happening still for all of you. And whether there's much scope to do much more this year, that's over to you. But that really, you're just being asked to have a look at this, agree this, and acknowledge the work that's scheduled in the next month, really. That's it. Okay.
Thank you, Alice. I'll just comment on the citizen participation group. We did, through this group, I think, suggest a number of external people to take part in that group. We are in the process of just having individual meetings with the people who are suggested to check they're interested and just discuss what that work might involve, and then we'll come back hopefully at the next meeting with a clearer idea of next steps around that particular piece of work. Is there any other questions or comments on the work plan, Paul?
Thank you. Maybe just have a private chat after the meeting about those people, because I'm not sure what was decided in the end, and just that I know that the group had an ambition that those people would have some diversity. Just to check back with you on that. Can I suggest an addition to the work plan, in bearing in mind that there are some appointments to external boards which do have SRAs and have a less of a time commitment than the NHS ones, such as the Fire Authority, Pension Authority, various roles within SIMCA that are paid and have a significantly less than 16 hours a month time commitment, that we do, as David suggested on the previous item, that we put something on the work plan which looks at SRAs for appointments to external boards.
Yeah, I'll point out that most of those SRAs are provided by the external board. I'm happy for us to have that discussion at our next governance committee pre-meeting. We'll have a discussion around that and adding it to the agenda, if that's okay. We can just, because I think we just need to be clear on what the parameters are, but we will have that discussion at a pre-meeting next time. Okay. Mike?
Thanks, Chair. A couple of things. We used to have on the work programme a plan for reviewing the role of the Finance Committee, which appears not to be there anymore. Are we going to do this? Because we're currently going into another financial year where we're not meeting the constitutional requirements of this committee, and it does need reviewing. That's my first question.
I think generally that's within the remits of the committees. I think the constitutional point you pick up is about the regularity of reports on the budget outturn. I think we'll probably pick that up as a discrete constitutional change to make sure that the constitution reflects what the practice is. But yeah, overall the purpose and remit of Finance Committee I think is properly within the remits of the committee's piece of work.
Yeah, could I just comment, please, David? Because things like important financial documents go straight to SNR for decision making. We have to ask for them in committee, so the medium-term financial analysis, for example. So if we're there to pre-scrutiny finance decisions, it's not happening. It's just going straight to SNR, and that's my concern. My other concern is that we appear to be the sort of the fallback in case SNR don't want to do something, they push it to us, and sometimes it's not appropriate and it goes back. So the role of the Finance Committee is blurred in my view, and we really need to nail it down. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. I think, as we said, we will make sure that's picked up. I think it has been identified already as part of the remit's work and within the scope of that work. Did you have a second point there?
Yes, please. Second one is, in the 6-month review last April, we mentioned, as part of ongoing work to develop the role of the LACs, about devolving decisions and budgets on minor local transport and highway issues to local area committees. That's actually happened this year, and a budget of 378,000 was allocated to do these sorts of minor works. However, there's no allocation next year, which means that that will stop. How do we deal with changes in decision making that leads to initiatives like that proposed by governance not actually going forward? Because will we get a report on the reasons why, for example, and should it be on the work plan? Thank you.
Sorry, could you just? I didn't quite get that, Mike. Sorry, can you?
Yeah, should this committee, having made a recommendation, which is now not happening next year, I know it's within the LAC review, but actually the process started this year, the spending took place, but it's no longer happening in the next financial year. So will we have a formal report from Transport regeneration and climate change about what happened in that and why, whether or not we should pick this up again and run with it, because it was a recommendation last April.
I suppose that's a matter for this committee as to whether it wants a follow-up on that matter, and if it wants to put that on its work programme.
Again, can we pick that up in our next pre-meeting and discuss that through properly, because I'm not sure I understand all the background on that one. So,
thank you. Yeah, just sort of following on from that, I think our working group, which I know is a whole committee working group on the policy committee remits, I think we probably need to meet sooner rather than later to actually look at the scope of that. And I think we did, over various discussions, informally, agree that a lot of things needed to be incorporated into that. And part of it does relate to the TRC issue about the need to reduce their workload. And I know a strong feeling has been that some of the decisions should be delegated. My understanding about the money that the LACs were given this time was that the decisions were still with TRC, because the LACs had no official decision making. So I don't know how that works, and I think that's what Mike's trying to establish. But I do think we need to look at quite urgently, because it's something we've kicked along quite a few times now, about the balance of work on the committees and their role, and engage in that, what they can delegate down, but also how things can come back up, so the communications as well with LAC. So I think that's going to be actually quite a broad scope piece of work, but it does need to start sooner rather than later.
yep, totally agree with you on that, and that's probably the more appropriate place to pick up the question, isn't it? A meeting of that group, but whichever comes first, we will make sure it is addressed. Is that okay? Any further questions on work plan? I'm conscious we've gone a bit over time. Apologies for that. If that's okay, it's just to say then that our final next meeting and the final meeting of the municipal year will be on the 27th of March. So I look forward to seeing you all there. And thanks to members for your contributions, all the officers for all your help and papers provided, and to the members of the public who attended today. Thank you.